in our Cultures of Conservation initiative. I'm Aaron Glass, an anthropologist on the faculty here, and one of the committee members that helps to program this initiative. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Lenape, Delaware people on whose ancestral territory we are gathered here tonight. Cultures of Conservation is a 5-year experiment generously supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in bringing cross-disciplinary humanities-based scholars into direct dialogue and collaboration with conservators and material scientists to explore new dimensions in object-based research and preservation. It's represented across the Graduate Center in courses taught and exhibits curated by a rotating team of visiting research fellows, in new units spread throughout our own existing curriculum, in relationships with area museums and their conservation departments, and in public lectures and events like we're having tonight. From the start, it was important to us that the pluralization of cultures in the initiative title should signal the topical breadth of our approach and our commitment. At the most immediate and persistent level, this has entailed bridging the culture of academia and the culture of the museum through close attention to the material properties of objects as means of both research and conservation. But we also want to stress that diverse peoples of the world bring their own cultural values and orientations to the material realm, their own fundamental notions of what the object is, what its proper relationships to persons might be, and what factors might contribute to protocols surrounding its preservation, if indeed it ought to be preserved at all. It's with this latter goal in mind, especially, that I'm extremely pleased to introduce tonight's event and to be moderating a conversation afterwards between our 4 eminent speakers. Tonight, we want to collectively think about what unique perspectives Indigenous people bring to the challenge of conserving objects in museological, academic, and community environments, and what relationship the preservation of objects might have to larger efforts to ensure cultural survival in the wake of colonialism. This event is the first in a series of keyword panel discussions, a new component of our larger conservation initiative. These panels will bring together scholars and conservators to explore 4 conventional values in the field of conservation practice: preservation of the material object, the reversibility or visibility of conservation treatment, attention to the physical and conceptual integrity of the original item, and respect for the intention of its maker and artist. On each panel, 4 speakers will address each of these key phrases to reveal how contemporary conservation projects both channel and challenge standard approaches to object-based research and museological treatment. We begin tonight by discussing a recent collaborative project to conserve a highly rare mid-19th century Alutiiq Kayak from Alaska, now in the collection of Harvard's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. Our 4 speakers have extensive experience in thinking about and contributing to such questions in the contexts of conservation projects aimed at renegotiating the relationship between mainstream museums and the Indigenous people whose cultural patrimony they have long collected, preserved, and exhibited under mostly Western scientific and aesthetic paradigms. I'll introduce each before they speak, and each will speak for about 20 minutes, after which I'll join them at the table up here for a dialogue and open conversation. So jot down questions along the way. For those watching online, you can tweet questions to #BardGradCenterTV. Our first speaker is T. Rose Holdcraft, the senior conservator responsible for conservation services and programs at Harvard's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, where she specializes in textiles and objects and where she participated in the Kayak project. Through long-range planning efforts, she couples exhibition and conservation activities with environmental improvement and conservation initiatives, preventative conservation programs, and conservation training of student interns. T. Rose Holdcraft. Thank you.
I'm glad you're all here, and thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to join this panel. To provide a stage for my comments for those who are unfamiliar with the Peabody Museum, its collecting activities began in the 1860s. Today, nearly 150 years later, the museum preserves and stewards hundreds of thousands of material culture items from around the world, along with their associated visual and written documentation. They are utilized in research, teaching, and public exhibition, and serving multicultural populations in all of those capacities. Museum stewardship evolves with new links and new stakeholder connections, resulting in new ways and ideas about how to go forward, engaging in collaboratively enhanced collection documentation, and in co-curating new knowledge. Featured here is the image of the 19th century kayak with Alfred Naumoff and Susan Malutin, both of Alutiiq background from Alaska. They are looking at the kayak in the space where it was being conserved for the first time during their visit in 2012. Also featured in the image is the Peabody Museum's project curator, Trish Capone, and conservation intern, Julie Ribbetts. I wanted just to provide a brief list of the goals of our Save America's Treasures grant-funded project that started in 2011 and went until 2013. And I also wanted just to share a few images from one of the first visits that Sven and Ronnie Lind had when they came to the Peabody and discovered the kayak in a very small space on the third floor. It was in above the red shelving that you see on the right there. It's about a 3.5-foot high area, and it was Ronnie Lind who recognized it as an Alutiiq kayak. Previously, it was unknown that it was such. For this project, we all wanted to work together in a manner that was as open as possible and as collaborative as possible. We tried to use a variety of communication formats to keep the process moving forward, given the enormous physical distance and time challenges. We used video conferencing from right at the get-go when we started our grant proposal thinking, and continue to do so throughout the project. As regards the 3-year Save America's Treasures project, the goals were and are as much about the process as the actual agreed-upon object interventions, a process in which we wanted to integrate as much knowledge from different perspectives and to use available technologies in that process. We were able to have an opportunity for our Alutiiq colleagues to go over with us to meet the conservation scientists at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, who were assisting us with the analysis of some surface residues from the skin and wood in hopes of answering questions that the Alutiiq people had about applied oils and possible pigment on this skin covering. I have been asked tonight to share and focus my comments on the conservation value of reversibility as a guideline in our conservation thinking and working process, and how it served in part in this kayak-related collections work. As a goal and concept, reversibility has a grounded place in our thinking process as we continue to evolve sound and appropriate conservation treatment decisions and solutions through consideration of multiple vectors that are ever changing with each new conservation challenge. Jane Down, in her recent adhesive compendium, points out sort of the broad landscape in which this can be applied and the debates around it. Prior to talking about the kayak, I just wanted to discuss briefly a few kayak-related objects that also comprise our study. Physical alterations are not always reversible, and with regard to malleable organic objects, they may be often not allowed to return to that form in which they were originally. So decisions revolve around whether the gain in new information after treatment of an object is more valuable than what will remain unknown by not doing any treatment or intervention. Shown here are 2 skin-based toolkits, one rolled and the other half open and half folded, just as they were originally, or as we believe they were originally received into the Peabody collections. These examples convey embedded knowledge about aspects of their daily use. On the left of the slide, the small bag, flattened and misaligned, was reshaped to enable sidewall repairs, and likewise to provide more understanding of its overall form and use. And you see the new form on the right. This ceremonial dance gutskin parka, as shown in the small rectangular package at the left, restricts knowledge of its materials and construction. Study and research would be limited by not intervening. The unfolding and conservation of the garment will allow safer research into its fabrication, as well as additionally, for us to monitor for insect activity, given its material vulnerability and the already partially damaged wool and feather embellishments. The gutskin cap at the lower left was slightly reformed, and its further reshaping can always continue as needed with cultural advisement when requested for exhibition or as other needs arise. This kayaker's gutskin parka posed similar and other questions regarding reversibility. Guidance by indigenous kayakers from the geocultural region from which the garment derives clearly provide more knowledge and understanding to such a garment. Discussions with Alutiiq colleagues, and in particular Sven, informed on the environment in which this featured garment was used and how a kayaker might remove it after using it. The conservation intervention was guided by both indigenous knowledge and the aspect of its construction being, in its current state, being partially inside out, allowing the stitching to be more easily studied if it retained this current format. The importance of documenting the discussion and the reasoning behind the extent or limitation of the conservation treatment has the potential to serve all community constituents into the future. Our combined Alutiiq and Peabody concerns in relation to the specific mid-19th century Alutiiq Kayak at the Peabody focused around its broken bifurcated bow, the numerous skin tears, the broken and misaligned wooden ribs, and the broken and separated deck skin straps. We wanted to work together to find the most appropriate solutions to address these issues. The first being critical to the kayak's future cultural interpretation, and the other issues whereby we wanted to reduce any further structural and visual damage prior to any further uses of the kayak. Here I'm showing some details of the broken bow, which actually was intact in the 1930s, but broken most likely at the time of its photography, and you can see in the lower left. It was during our research that we discovered these photographs at the UPenn archives. Our conversations to date have circled around the consideration of the replication of the bow and its temporary positioning to inform about this cultural attribution, which is unique from other kayaks and unique from the Alutiiq bifurcated bow. Due to time limitations here now, I will share some perspectives on the skin tears, which risk elongation without intervention. The issue of the skin tears was one that would more immediately impact the kayak's long-term future preservation and uses and required an additive yet minimal treatment. The working process involved lots of planning and conversations with our Alutiiq collaborators, as well as written and visual documentation of its condition and proposals for possible treatments, a conservation literature review, and lots of discussions regarding those findings, and our exchanges with conservators who had worked with kayaks and their conservation issues from Canada, Alaska, and on the East Coast. Through discussions with Sven and with Alaska colleagues who are conservators, Scott Carley and Dana Senge, we learned about a 3-person kayak, also known as a bidarka, which you see here on the left, and the need for this particular kayak to be retreated after its prior 30-year treatment. And you can see an image of that in 1978. So Dana was invited to rework with with Alfred and Susie in that regard to look at the state of that kayak. Through this process, we understood further the types of materials and treatments that Sven and Alfred were knowledgeable about, and their preferences to be considered as part of conservation selection process and decisions, such as whether or not it might be suitable to use an aqueous adhesive. Their perspectives prompted us and focused us into further investigation into materials that might work with the Warrior Whaler kayak at the Peabody. We had a couple phases of honing in on adhesives and materials to address the skin tears. A very quick thing that we wanted to do was to share some of the materials that we might use, and we sent out samples to Kodiak, Alaska, so that Susie and Sven could see what might be involved in trying to stabilize those tears. We also undertook a testing phase to look at tensile strength, some of the backing materials we were considering, as well as the shear strength of the adhesive bonds with the backing materials. And then later also, we did some further looking into Lascaux and acrylic adhesive in terms of looking at mixtures and to consider and evaluate their working properties. Investigating materials for the additive repairs needed for this aged skin covering considered the potential reversibility in the event of a retreatment that might be needed, such as what happened with the one in Kodiak, the Bidarka, that I just previously shared with you. Framing our process was the open working space for the project, located in one of the Peabody Museum's public exhibit galleries, whereby use of organic or toxic solvents would be restricted. Some adhesives were eliminated due to undesirable working properties, their strength, or due to inherent vice, or the oily skin surfaces and the difficulty in achieving sufficient bonding, or the impracticality of using heat activation given the location of the tear. We also knew that the kayak would likely be loaned and would require a lengthy transit to Kodiak, and the issue of expansion and contraction seemed prominent, or at least noted to us, and we wanted to kind of keep that in our minds as we were thinking about a treatment solution. All of the relevant information that we gathered and the perspectives guided our treatment selection and application process. The tear, which was accessible from both sides of the skin, was the hatch tear. No other tears could we actually observe closely how the bond contact was being achieved with the backing material. Additional lighting and mirrors assisted in this process. A deck tear at some distance from the hatch meant no interior access to the skin, and thus we applied a similar working technique devised in 1992 by Carol Dignard at the Canadian Conservation Institute, where she used spatulas and magnets to provide a period of close contact during the drying of the adhesive on the backing material. When possible, the skin was degreased. Both the skin surface and the backing material were sized or applied with adhesive and left for a short time prior to pressure application with the spatula and magnets, and then top weighted with weights. A narrow strip of lightweight pigmented Japanese paper was then adhered crosswise across the paper tabs. Another tear shown here near a sinew-stitched seam, which was quite intact, was treated in a similar manner as the one previously shown, with very narrow paper strips and a microspatula and magnets. A tear along the stern could only be filled as a means to prevent its further elongation due to limited access and being on top of a wood element. You're seeing it on the left prior to in-painting. On the right, images show the reattachment of separated skin straps on the deck and loss compensation utilizing pigmented heavyweight Japanese paper, wheat starch paste, and acrylic adhesives. While aesthetic reintegration was not the top priority, it was important to Sven and Alpha to not disguise or lose sight of those prior damaged areas, as they inform of the typical areas on a kayak where future risk may likely occur. Being able to see the locations of prior tears was a consideration in the final phase of the conservation intervention. In connection with every treatment solution, there must be equally well designed and conceived preventive measures. In this case, a lightweight rigid storage housing of honeycomb polyethylene board with an internal custom fit cavity of ethafoam provided additional support and buffering from environmental shifts, as well as for safe handling. Lifting and packing instructions provide information for future handlers. An exterior crate for transit will be constructed in the next few months to support the kayak's loan to Alaska in the spring 2016, when it will be on view in late April at the Alutiiq Museum in Kodiak Island, Alaska. To conclude, I would like to express my appreciation as a participant of this intercultural program between the Alutiiq and Peabody communities. I appreciate so much the open sharing and back and forth of information. I am so glad, Sven, for your initiative, inspiration to pursue this work and to encourage Susan Milutin and Alfred Naumoff in this shared effort. We are all looking forward to continuing our relationships with them, with you, and with members of the Alutiiq Museum as part of this upcoming loan, which will be likely for a 10-year period. This has been a unique an important opportunity to engage with so many individuals with so many different perspectives. I can easily say that all of the Peabody project members and the conservation team in particular have been most grateful for this opportunity as well. And we are most assuredly indebted to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, who have administered the Save America's Treasures Grant program, for which funding has been crucial to enable all of this work to happen.
Thank you. Next up, we have Dr. Sven Haakanson, Jr., who is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Washington and Curator of North American Anthropology at the Burke Museum. From 2000 to 2013, and during the Kayak Conservation Project, he served as the Executive Director of the Alutiiq Museum in Kodiak, Alaska. As a native Sukpiak archaeologist and artist, Haakanson straddles worlds in an effort to resuscitate, preserve, and give contemporary meaning to indigenous histories and traditions. Sven Haakanson.
Well, I want to start with just saying thank you, Aaron, for inviting me to come and present and be part of this discussion. And I was asked to talk about preservation. And for me, as soon as it comes up, does it? Okay. Thank you. Yep. For myself, but my own philosophy about the research and work I do is based on what we're doing for our future. Why are we doing all this work? And for who? And for me, what's more important is making sure we keep in mind that the work we're doing is for our future. Whether you're native or non-native, it's for the future of our future of humanity. The project we just listened to, let's see if that goes, with the Warriors Kayak. That all started with Ronnie Lind and I crawling in that space. I have to explain that Ronnie Lind had already had 2 heart bypasses, so I was worried about him having a major heart attack crawling in that space. And as we were getting down, he looks over and sees his boat, and he's like, wow, look at that. And I'm like, isn't that a Unangan kayak? And he says, no, come here, let me slap you. Look at it closely. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. So I crawled over 2 other boats to look at, and he's like, look at what was on there. Look what's on that boat. There was human hair sewn into it. And he's like, what have I been telling you about these collections? The human hair sewn into it is embodiment of our people. It's the not only a mnemonic device of remembering people, but it's a way of sharing. And that started a whole dialogue with T. Rose and the staff at the Peabody Museum for this project. And it started with sort of accidentally glancing and seeing this boat. It wasn't even part of what we were supposed to be looking at because it didn't fall under NAGPRA. And that started a whole new discussion for me of, okay, well, what else are we really missing in these collections? We went back in 2012, again, as part of this consultation, and I went with Alfred Nomoff and Susie Malutin. And as we're going through this project, as T. Rose explained, consultation, conservation, and they also allowed us to go and look at the collections. And one of the wonderful things that we discovered in that one visit was we found a double-bladed paddle that was associated to our tribe. There are no full-size double-bladed paddles that exist in the world. Not only do they have the only known single-man warrior's kayak, they have the only known double-bladed paddle in the world. Well, while we can't get the kayak at that time, how can we get this information back home? So what I did with Alfred is we sketched that paddle out. I was going out working in the villages with other artists. By May, we had one made. And subsequently, I've made several of those. So we went from not having double-bladed paddles or knowing about them to putting them back into a living context. And when I'm working with museums and working with other indigenous scholars, I like to look at collections, and I sketched this one out. Then I contacted Alfred, and I figured, well, let's figure out how we can get this information to the villages. How do we make what we are doing relevant? So we went out to the villages, and we built and made 28 model kayaks across Kodiak. And that's the first time in over a century that we've done that. In fact, I have a colleague here, Amelia Cortez, who was part of that. She volunteered her time to come to Kodiak and work with the kids to where, we were working with them, and each of these kids spent 40 hours that week building these boats. So taking stuff that we have in our collections and figuring out ways we can put them back into a living context, using the models that we have, using the other objects. Well, what else are we missing? This past couple of years, I've been researching open boats, anyas. And they disappeared from use on Kodiak in the 1850s. And these are typical bulbous bow boats here. And these were sketched by Weber in 1788. And so where are they? They don't exist on Kodiak. They're not in our living memory, yet there's 13 models that exist around the world in museums. There are no full-size ones. How do we learn from those collections? So the museum I work at now, at the Burke Museum, they have one model. And so having access as a curator, I spent time researching other scholars, other researchers, what they've sketched, look at their diagrams, looked at what museums have at the Museum of Ethnography and Anthropology. In Russia, they have 5 models, so photographed and sketched those out, to looking at archaeological collections. So trying to figure out, okay, how were these boats built? What can we learn from the archaeological material? What can we learn from ethnographic material and historical accounts? To how do we actually build them? So in 2014, working through the, I keep saying Peabody, but working through the Burke Museum, I sketched out the models and made kits to understand how this boat was made, and went out to the village of Alutiiq. Can we build these boats in a week? Can it be possible? No glue, no nails, making sure it's traditional. Because what's really, really important is if we're going to be reintroducing knowledge that we have in our collections in museums, we should and we better do it right. We don't want to be teaching the wrong thing. And so making sure that we have that information correct. We went out. I spent time with Mitch and Judy. I've been working with them for 16 years in Alutiiq. And I worked with there was 5 young boys that ended up building the boats with me. And they spent hours building these boats, learning the ties, learning the engineering, and trying to understand how these boats were used. Well, that's wonderful. We built these boats, great. Now we have, instead of 13 models that are built traditionally, we now have 13 more. You now have 26 that exist in the world. That's great. Well, what's the science behind this boat, this bulbous bow? Well, as I was talking with those young men and anybody at the camp, this bulbous bow is a recent introduction or invention by the military for decreasing the fuel consumption and increasing the speed on boats. Yet archaeologically, we've had that for 1,000 years or more. Can you imagine the ideas that you spark in that generation of, wait a minute, look at how scientific we were. Look at the engineering designs that we had that we've forgotten, but now, thanks to museums, thanks to the preservation, we can reintroduce that information. in the right context. So this past summer is how can we take this to the next level and why? Can we build a full-size Alutiiq? I mean, the goal to put this knowledge back into a living context so it becomes part of a museum in a community. How do we make it so the work is relevant to us and our communities? Can it be done? So this summer, I embarked on an endeavor to find wood donated at the Burke Museum, worked with my colleagues, took that model I made, and built, with staff help, a 25-foot Alutiiq in the back of the Burke Museum in 2 weeks. Well, that's great, but that's a museum. How do I take that information back to the community from where it came? And can we do that in the same way? So this summer, in August, I went down to Archaeology to work with Mitch and Judy and the kids. And in that process, this is Mitch, his grandson, and his son. We had 3 generations working on this boat. And then his other son worked on the bow. And working in a very, typical camp setting, we ended up building another full-size Alutiiq. So again, starting with preservation, but putting preservation back into a living context and making it relevant for the communities. But to me, for that then shows how important our museums are, how important our role is caring for collections, caring for the histories of all these indigenous peoples, or all our own people. And learning to build an Alutiiq, it shows how collections are relevant and important to our communities. Our museum collections are living because of the knowledge that is embodied within each piece. Past, present knowledge is living. Repatriation of knowledge, not just object and pieces. And for me, each piece is an written history of our cultural pasts. So instead of looking at something that is, oh, that's a beautiful piece, how do we get that information into the hands, hearts, and knowledge of the communities from where it came? And that's a huge challenge that I challenge all museum professionals, is yes, that's important, but we need to share another message. We care for a history that is still there. And for me, what I see happening with the next generation coming up is, instead of saying we didn't know anything, we step back and we look at collections, we look at our history, and we show how we were scientists, how we were explorers, how we understood our environment. I mean, all of these other things that can then help give our children a foundation to stand on. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Sven. Our next speaker is Judith Levinson, Director of Conservation in the Division of Anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History, where she works to conserve the museum's archaeological and ethnographic collections, as well as dioramas and other permanent and temporary exhibits. She's been a lecturer at the Conservation Center of the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, teaching advanced courses in inorganic materials and exhibit conservation.
Thank you, Erin. So, the key word that I was asked to address in relation to the Alutiiq Kayak project, to conservation at the American Museum of Natural History, and how indigenous concerns may challenge traditional conservation practice, was actually authenticity or integrity, not just integrity. So, what do we mean by authenticity? There's a surprisingly enormous amount of literature in the art history, philosophy, and related fields about what is meant by authenticity, going back all the way to the Greeks, and also about authenticity in relation to conservation, of which I am by no means an expert. Given that, I'm not really going to get into the weeds about it, and will admittedly use a very simplistic model as a practical construct for this discussion. As recently expressed in a paper by conservator David Scott, authenticity may be viewed as the interaction between three related aspects of the work of art or artifact: the physical, the aesthetic, and the conceptual. As conservators, we are heavily steeped in the physical, in the material aspects of artifacts. In other words, in the nature of materials and how they deteriorate or how they may be changed by use or the environment. And as ethnographic conservators, we also endeavor to be sensitive to cultural context and meaning, and respectful of the intangible aspects inherent in the artifacts. It is clear that authenticity is a property that emerges through specific interactions between people and things. Conservation can serve to support the inherent value of artifacts and the interrelation between them and the people who made and used them, as well as preserve and present their material and aesthetic aspects to peoples from diverse cultures. The Peabody Museum's Alutiiq Kayak project represented a serendipitous opportunity to merge the physical aspects of object conservation with the conceptual integrity of the artifact and access to it by knowledgeable source community colleagues. In every regard, this project is a strong model for a fully realized inclusive collaboration. We've already heard a lot about the kayak project tonight, so I'm not going to repeat its various components. Such opportunities for collaboration or partnership are rare, however, when the collections are distant from the source communities, as is also the case at the American Museum, or where there isn't an integrated structure for consultation and partnership, such as that which exists at the National Museum of the American Indian. Over the past 30 years, we at the American Museum have had an uneven history of engagement with descendant communities around conservation treatment issues. I'm going to present a few projects that represent the range of our experiences, two of which involved Native partners and had consequences for our treatment decisions, and one that has not so far. We're currently undertaking a project that approximates some facets of the Alutiiq Kayak work. We're treating a selection of pieces from the museum's renowned Siberian collection that was formed as part of the Jessup North Pacific expedition directed by Franz Boas. This is a treatment and rehousing project to stabilize and make accessible artifacts that are often requested for study or loan and easily damaged by handling. Indigenous concerns are for access, as much of their cultural legacy was destroyed under Tsarist and Soviet rule, and indigenous Siberian peoples have been undergoing a revitalization process much like that of Native Americans and First Nations peoples. Many of the pieces being treated consist of fur and hide clothing. Treatments are being undertaken to clean, reshape, and stabilize them, repairing tears, strengthening attachment of auxiliary elements, addressing unstable beadwork, and reducing corrosion to metal components. Fabrication and decorative techniques are being documented. All pieces are being tested to identify pesticide residues, and hairs have been sampled to identify the source animals, thereby enriching our records. The coats are being rehoused, as you can see on the right, in such a way as to protect them from improper handling, as well as to make them safely accessible to researchers and craftsmen who wish to study them. During the course of the project, we've had several visits from Native advisors informing us as to past and current cultural practices, and we will soon be undertaking Skype communications with other consultants in Russia. And actually, the reason why Sven is able to be here today and this week is working with us on this project. The most important goals of the project, increasing access, are being met. Improved access for Native and other scholars and craftspeople, and increased material and cultural-based knowledge for conservators and others. The next two projects I will describe, on the other hand, represent a range that at one end included Native partners and reached satisfactory treatment compromises for all parties, and on the other hand, has not included Native partners, and treatment decisions remain that will hopefully be addressed in the future with Indigenous participation. As early as the 1980s, during preparation for objects for display in the exhibit Chiefly Feasts, the enduring Kwakiutl potlatch, Kwakwakiwak consultants had an active voice in the production of the exhibit, as well as in the course of conservation treatment. Gloria Cranmer Webster, a high-ranking Kwakwakiwak and former director of the Umista Cultural Center, was a co-curator to the exhibit, and a group of 10 elders came to the museum to act as cultural advisors. These consultants visited the conservation lab and had a part in determining the course of conservation decisions, which primarily consisted of determining what degree of loss compensation should be undertaken. We were challenged in our principles as conservators in response to treatment goals desired by our native partners, as they wanted far more restoration than we were comfortable with. As I wrote in an earlier paper about conservation decision-making, the extent and type of compensation we typically undertake is deeply embedded in our own cultural context, and prior to this project, our treatments tended to be made to satisfy curators or our own personal aesthetic. The Kwakwakiwak desire for extensive restoration was governed by how they and their ancestors would have repaired their pieces in use, and it was confusing for them how we conservators are able to live with the complexity or contradiction in doing one type of treatment for one situation and another for a different application. Moreover, the concept of reversibility was really puzzling to them, as within their culture there were more prescriptive ways of dealing with damaged artifacts. Tony Hunt pointed out that carvings such as the ones about which we were conferring were the property of high-ranking officials and would not have been shown in a state of disrepair. To our consultants, integrity of these pieces lay in restoring their physical condition, which showed respect for the intangible qualities with which they were imbued. For a number of these pieces, we were able to arrive at treatment compromises that were acceptable to our native consultants and satisfied our Western-oriented conservation ideals of the time. For instance, this mask entered the collection with long strips of some material filling the holes around its perimeter, as can be seen in this drawing from 1909, but with only vestiges of the material remaining in 1990. After identifying the vestige substance as baleen, we were able to replace it in a reversible manner with a mount attached to the reverse side that holds the replacement strips of baleen, devising a compromise solution that restored authenticity to the mask. And here's another similar solution to replace lost hair from this wolf mask. A slightly different treatment outcome was developed for this mask, which was pictured on the cover of the exhibit catalog. Even after hours of treatment attempting to stabilize the extremely shattered cedar bark, the mask was in no condition to travel, but needed to remain in the exhibit as it was pictured on the cover. Our consultants recommended total replacement of the bark and provided us with new material, which we dyed and bleached to approximate the appearance of the original bark. The old cedar bark was taken off the mask, documented, and preserved as a separate part in storage, while the new cedar bark was affixed to the back of the mask. These treatments allowed us to restore the physical, aesthetic, and conceptual integrity to these important carvings in a way that was ethically comfortable to the conservators and satisfied our native partners' desire for respect of their ancestors and their heritage. Oftentimes in our work, however, a less than ideal balance between the physical, aesthetic, and conceptual or intangible aspects of treatment we undertake exists, though we may strive to support holistic integrity through them. At the other extreme, we recently completed a project to conserve some totem poles and other carvings in the Northwest Coast Hall without the benefit of Native involvement. A planned renovation of the hall, which would have included numerous Native collaborators, was canceled because of the 2009 financial meltdown, but support for treatment of some of the large carvings had been received under separate funding. I suppose we could have made the decision not to carry out the project, but given the difficulty of attaining funds for conservation work, we decided to proceed. The major treatment goal was to provide stabilization to the extent that routine, frequent surface cleaning could be undertaken without causing further damage or loss of wood to the pieces. We were able to successfully address the physical instabilities and some aesthetic aspects of the carvings, but we had limited success with surface cleaning. Coatings applied in earlier decades in the museum to protect or refurbish the pieces had been applied over dirty surfaces, locking in the dirt, darkening and seeping into the friable wood, obscuring carving details and colors. Determining the proper course to reduce or remove the coatings without damaging the underlying paints or providing a stripped appearance to the wood was technically difficult and beyond the scope of the grant, and we preferred to wait until we had appropriate partners from descendant communities to weigh in on the coating issue. But then, during installation of a fire suppression system in the Northwest Coast Hall, 4 18-foot tall poles, not part of the original grant, were temporarily taken down. It turns out that these poles were carved as a commission to the museum, were never raised. I think I'm one back. I'm having a little problem here. Okay, never mind. Were never raised and were shipped directly here. For this reason, we felt more comfortable to explore the possibility of coating removal on these poles than on other pieces in the hall, for which we felt Indigenous partners should have some authority in the decision-making process. I really wish we could get these. Okay. We were only partially successful in determining appropriate removal procedures, and further research is required. In thinking about the pervasive coatings on the remainder of the carvings in the hall and their potential future removal, an important question is introduced. What is it that we would be preserving or restoring by removing the coatings? Would it be simply restoring the thing to an earlier physical appearance, or would it be more than that? Would coating removal also restore some intangible authenticity that is represented by the thing? Or has that inherent integrity not even been affected by the coatings? And another question is raised. If we were able to find successful removal solutions, do we wait until appropriate partners can be located with whom to discuss treatment options, even though waiting means that no one, native or non-native alike, can fully appreciate them for their physical, aesthetic, and intangible qualities? My earlier examples showed that through bringing the native voice into conservation decisions, we were able to arrive at mutually satisfying solutions. But when the conservator needs to make substantial treatment decisions and does not have input of representatives from source communities, how is one to proceed? How would we design a treatment course to do no harm to the intangible aspects of the pieces if there were no one to speak to the potential cultural implications of particular treatment options? No doubt, depending on whom you would ask, there would be a range of answers to these and similar questions. So, to conclude, through our work at AM&H, we strive to push the boundaries of established conservation norms to include partnerships where possible with stakeholder communities, improving access, using available scientific tools to increase knowledge, opening lines of communication, and including Native authority for treatment decisions, which will undoubtedly keep our collections culturally relative. We're grateful for funding from the Institute for Museum and Library Services and the Stockman Family Foundation for the work we've been able to undertake on the totem poles and on the Siberian project we're currently undertaking.
Thank you, Judith. Finally, we will hear from George Nicholas, Professor of Archaeology at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia, and Director of the Intellectual Property Issues in Cultural Heritage Project, or IPINCH, a 7-year initiative funded by the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. His research focuses on Indigenous peoples and archaeology, intellectual property issues relating to archaeology, the archaeology and human ecology of wetlands, and archaeological theory and practice. George Nicholas.
Thank you, Aaron, and it's a pleasure to be here in Lenape territory. There are two things that make this visit extra special. And the first is an opportunity to meet Sven Haakanson. Some years ago, I edited a volume. Sven and I had never met, but his contribution, his biography, autobiography, was just captured my attention immediately in terms of his efforts with his community. And the second thing that makes it special is that this is the centenary of my mother's birth here in New York City. And here's a picture of my mother, Helen, and obviously she knew where my career was going. I'm the wild card in the bunch, as Aaron has pointed out. I'm coming at this from a very different direction, and my comments are going to be oriented quite broadly, not so much at the Alutiiq Kayak, but at looking at the broader context in which such kinds of collaborations are now playing out and why they're so important. And I have nothing but admiration for this project because what it does is it helps to address some of these issues that indigenous peoples have been dealing with for so long. And that is the effort to regain control over their basic rights to heritage, both cultural and intellectual. And this extends both to archaeology and to contemporary issues as well. And there's two things, 2 points of reference that I have here. The first is my work in the realm of what's called indigenous archaeology. And this is a kind of archaeology that is informed by indigenous sensibilities. It's aimed at addressing indigenous needs. And it is helping in a very sustained way to make archaeology more relevant, more responsible, and more representative. And the kinds of work that we're seeing with the Kayak project are very much in that regard, where you have the use of both archaeological and ethnographic and contemporary information and resources aimed at meeting community values. The second point of reference is the intellectual property issues and cultural heritage project that I've been directing since it began in 2008. And this is an international collaboration of 50 scholars, 25 partnering communities, about over 100 associate members. And our goal is basically to identify and try to address issues that especially indigenous peoples have been having in terms of impact on and lack of access to their heritage, especially the intangible aspects of their heritage, as well as promote more equitable, more fair ways of doing research with them so that they are the primary beneficiaries because it's research on their heritage, regardless of whoever is doing it. One of the major components of the iPinch project is a series of community-based projects. And in these projects, the community is literally, no, I can't say that, they're not literally in the driver's seat, but they are the ones who identify what the project is, what the methods are. They work with outside scholars, and they ensure that no information leaves the community that should not be leaving the community, so that they have complete control over the process from start to finish. And we have these projects mostly in North America, but also extending, and I think we've lost the world map there. So that's North America. And Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Kyrgyzstan, and working with the Ainu of northern Japan. And one of our projects is with the Inuvialuit, far northwestern Canada. And their project deals with a collection in the Smithsonian Museum, McFarland collection that left the community about 150 or 160 years ago. And this is a project aimed at repatriating not the objects themselves, but the information in those objects. And we've also been working with the Inuit Heritage Trust and with the IHT as well as with the Inuvialuit. What is so important to them is ensuring that heritage, wherever it is that is their heritage, is accessible to the community members. And this includes visiting and working with museums who hold some of those collections. It involves developing research protocols and otherwise foregrounding community needs. And this brings me to the Alutiiq Kayak project, which is remarkable because it is where this kind of work needs to be going, and it's where it is going with some of the projects that I've been involved with, such as with the Inuvialuit, with the Inuit Heritage Trust, with the Avatac Heritage Institute, and other IPINCH projects. And so how I'm framing this is not so much about the kayak project, although I'll be referencing from time to time, but again, looking beyond this to some of the key issues relating to some of these topics that are playing out in the realm of heritage around the world. And most important is that relationship between intangible and tangible heritage, which for many indigenous peoples, there is no division. There's one and the same. And this is especially apparent when we look at a definition of heritage that I think is particularly, that works particularly well. And as you see, it's not material culture that dominates. It is all those intangible aspects. And yet if you ask a person on the street about heritage, they immediately think about things. And the point is that none of those things has any values without the intangible aspects, the stories, the songs, the knowledge that's embedded in them. And so here is a series of questions then that I'm posing that provide a point of reference to the kayak but extend far beyond that. So what's the best way to describe the kayak? Well, when I was thinking about the kayak project and what was available for me to read on it, I was immediately reminded of a project in the Macaw Museum in Neah Bay, Washington, that was focused on materials from a ancestral Macaw village of Ozette, which was covered in a mudslide with remarkable preservation. And this became the focus of a community museum. And contrary to how museums have normally operated using scientific or archaeological or other kinds of classification systems, here the classification and the presentation of the materials was informed by such things as the Macaw language, in which word prefixes or suffixes provided clues to the deeper understanding of the meaning of those objects, so that there was a shared term for both wooden boxes and canoes as containers, because they both contain things. In the case of canoes, it contains people. So this provides us a deeper understanding of, if we so choose to pursue it, and if we have the information available to us, provides us a deeper understanding of objects and their heritage context. And so this then begs the question, is there the opportunity, or is it already planned, to utilize Alutiiq names and such things in the presentation of the kayak? The second question, the intention. What is the intention of the maker? This is something that Aaron had suggested that I address. And when I began to think of this, thinking about kayaks and kayak manufacturing, I was immediately reminded of this wonderful series of films put up by the National Film Board of Canada, focusing on the Netsilik in the mid-20th century. And there's a series on the manufacture of a kayak from start to finish. But is that applicable here? Well, not really, at least at one reading, because this is not just a kayak, it is a very special kind of kayak. It's a warrior or whaler's kayak. And this is something that presumably had restricted use. Now, I don't have any real knowledge of Alutiiq culture, but so some of my comments are posed rather generally. But I'm presuming that there was restricted use of this, that use was by an individual, by a family, perhaps by a clan, or by a society of warriors or whalers. And you can start to see the intellectual property or the special knowledge or the special responsibilities that that object then has for those individuals and their relationship to those individuals and to the kayak in terms of the knowledge, the ceremonies perhaps, the responsibilities that they have. And this then begs the question of who had rights to it, who had rights to make it, who had rights to use it, who had rights to repair or care for it. And these are questions that can only come from the knowledge holders, but they are questions that should at least be considered during the processes of considering how this was used and how it is being used today in a very different context. What's the proper way to care for it, to conserve it? And here you have, and you've already heard of this, a series of steps, very intensive work to bring this into the best possible condition it can be restored to using traditional techniques, using reversible techniques. But there are other considerations too for other kinds of projects, other kinds of objects, in terms of how should it be conserved or cared for or repaired. And in this case, there was recently a great collaboration between the Tlingit and the Smithsonian Institution, in which a number of ceremonial objects, masks, rattles, and so on, were scanned and 3D scanned and printed or replicated, so that objects, ceremonial and important objects, could be repaired, could be, in fact, returned to use within the communities. So this is a whole new technology that is providing indigenous peoples with ways to make copies or pieces to use in repairing an object. But on the other hand, there are some considerations to briefly mention here. And one has to do with how indigenous peoples consider the proper care for certain kinds of objects. This is a photograph of a Zuni shrine that's holding the Ehuda, the twin war gods. And the active gods are standing upright, and when the gods are being renewed, the old ones are taken, they're put on the pile in the back, and they're left to deteriorate. And for the Zuni, the proper care of these is to let them deteriorate. But many of them are in museums, in climate-controlled rooms, where they will never deteriorate, and everyone is wearing the Mickey Mouse white gloves to touch them. So here is a case where proper care for an indigenous item is fundamentally different from how proper care in most museums would unfold. And another aspect to this, when we're talking about making replicas, is that for some peoples, there is no difference between the replica and the original. And Gwen Isaac has looked at this in a great article in Current Anthropology for the Zuni. And the Zuni have raised concern that even when Boy Scout troop is making replica kachinas. Those kachinas, however crude they may be, incorporate the power and spirit of the kachinas, and they are dangerous. They are powerful. So for the Zuni, replicas are not really allowed outside of their proper ceremonial circumstances. So this is a concern that we may raise with other kinds of replication projects. And what's important in all of this is that the only way that one can ascertain this kind of information is by talking to the community members. This is from one of our iPinch projects with the Moriori in the Chatham Islands of New Zealand. And this young girl is standing next to what most of us would call a dendroglyph, that is a carved tree. But for the Moriori, that is a living ancestor in a sacred grove. That ancestor is there right now, not in some other dimension, but in this dimension. And so for many indigenous peoples, there is not that usual dichotomy between the supernatural world and the natural world. That dichotomy is absent, that you have the folding of these dimensions together. And this has all sorts of implications for heritage management, for museum curation, and much more. What's the future of the kayak? It's a really bright future. I mean, as Sven has outlined, the kayak and similar projects has energized the community. There is the influx of old knowledge into the living community. And I think we could only stand back and wait to see what wonderful things unfold in that context. What's also important, and this is mirrored in every single community-based iPinch project, the communities are looking for ways to re-engage youth and elders. That is so important to them. And that's really what you're seeing with Sven's presentation. That connection is so strong, and it's going places. And there are other ways that museums are now seeking to expand their usual purview through websites. And this is the one for the Inuvialuit project. It's part of their Living History project. And here you have objects, in this case kayak miniatures, that are made accessible from whatever museum they had been in through what's called the Reciprocal Research Network. And there are description there, there's community interpretations for many of these objects. And there's much, much more to this website, so I encourage you to take a look, because here you've got the community deciding how they want to present themselves, how they want to present their heritage on their own terms. And then the question of fidelity. Again, this is something that Aaron had suggested I look at. This is, I think, a really challenging topic. In part because there's a tension that is implicit here if we seek to talk about fidelity, a tension between the original purpose of the kayak and how we're looking at it today, or how especially the Alutiiq are looking at that today. We can look at fidelity in terms of the intentions of the original makers, at any one of these levels, although we cannot really tease these apart. But all of these are likely to have a role in determining what that original intent was. What, in terms of its function, in terms of who had the responsibility, and much, much more. But we could also look at this in terms of fidelity relative to contemporary times, contemporary challenges. And the first is something that Sven's already talked about in terms of how is the warrior kayak now being used today within the community. But there are other potential applications of knowledge about the kayak. And again, this extends beyond this particular project. One is how other indigenous peoples may look at indigenous heritage of someone else, some other indigenous group. And another is how non-indigenous or non-Aleut people may look at this kind of information. So here's briefly 3 examples. The first is with the Inuvialuit project, the reintroduction of traditional moccasin designs back to the community after 150 years. So these are now being replicated. They're now part of the, moccasin styles that are within Inuvialuit communities. In terms of the second, here's how other indigenous peoples may look at someone else's. This is Aboriginal artist Brian Youngin's very famous recreation of classic Northwest Coast masks using Nike basketball shoes. This is very playful, very innovative, and I've yet to have one negative word said about this by any Northwest Coast person that I've talked to. So I think this is done in a particular way where it's not deemed as offensive. And on the other hand, here you have traditional snow goggles that on the right you can buy in plastic for 40 pounds the last time I looked. And I was with my colleague from Inuit Heritage Trust, Ralph Konak, and I pointed out this ad to him, and he was dumbfounded that anyone would ever think of making modern plastic sunglasses using this traditional design. So finally, when we go to look at what is the best way to conserve, to preserve such items as the Alutiiq Kayak, the most important thing we have to recognize is that it's not just about things. It's about everything that is associated with that kayak in its original context, to the degree that we can determine that. And so here we have this connection between the knowledge holders on the top and the knowledge developers, whoever they may be. Researchers and museum curators and archaeologists, database developers. And in between those two groups, it is very important to look at these steps, these elements of what will be a successful, hopefully, collaboration. Memoranda of agreements, research protocols, attribution and acknowledgement, a way to assess benefit sharing and ensure that it's fair and equitable. And in all of these projects, where they are successful, whether it's the Alutiiq Kayak project, whether it's some of the iPinch projects I've mentioned, these are the shared things that we are seeing. That community priorities are what is really driving such projects, and that is the gauge of success, when the community is satisfied. And again, coming back to that last point, that connection between youth and elders is vital in all such projects, and making that connection between the past, the present, and future generations. And one last thing, as Steve Jobs would say, now at the Alutiiq Museum on extended loan, perhaps at some point in the future we will see this now at the Peabody Museum on extended loan. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I would like to invite all our speakers up to the table and brush off your questions in the audience, and we'll have an open conversation about all of this. Thanks. Thank you, everybody, for your really excellent and interlocking presentations. Maybe I'll get the ball rolling by asking Sven and T. Rose a kind of a double-sided question, maybe thinking about putting two aspects of your presentations together. And so one part of this question is really to Sven, and whether any aspects of the material analysis and the decisions about how actually to intervene in the object, to stabilize it, to repair it, whether any of those technical decisions were part of the knowledge recovery process, what relationship that had with the subsequent series of projects you walked us through, and turning to the models, turning to different kinds of boats, or was it, or didn't they? I'm interested about that, about where the bridge is between the technical work in the museum and the knowledge recovery work in the community. And the second part of that question is, in the article that T. Rose shared with us and that George cited about the project from a conservation journal, mentioned the possibility, the interest in potentially repairing the bow, but by the time that was written, that was still uncertain. So the second part of this question is, again, speaking to Judy's presentation about the chiefly feast examples and the kind of where do the conversations stand now about interventions into the bow, and whether those interventions would be motivated by exhibition value, by knowledge recovery value, by respect for the object. So those two-part question there.
All right, well, I guess I'll...
And either of you.
I'll jump in. Well, to answer your first question, I mean, the wonderful thing and the things that came out of this project, well, the biggest thing was based on the kayak size and the skin size. We looked at that, myself, Susie, and Alfred. We thought that the skins were sea lion. But with the analysis of the skins, it came out it was harbor seal. So the harbor seals are about a foot smaller than they are today, and that's substantial. And to us, that actually shows environmental changes over the last century or even 200 years. And so we started asking, or trying to figure out, well, then what would we use today in materials if we did that, if we actually decided to use actual skins. So that was one of the aha things for all of us. As for the bow, but I no longer work for the museum, but I know that things are on hold because of some financial challenges there. But I'm hoping that eventually Alfred and Susie will be able to do some work with the Peabody Museum. Yeah. And that's...
And a small detail around that was when we were discussing this in 2012 and 2013, the interest was to have Alfred perhaps carve the horn that's missing, but also to have it covered with sealskin. And that would be problematic to have that done in Massachusetts. So the intention was that Alfred would carve the wood and the kayak would be there, and then we would temporarily position it on site once the kayak was there. So that kind of was because we were trying to address the issues of having endangered species materials. It would have to come off before it returned back to the Peabody after the loan.
So it would be reversible.
Yes. Yes. And what was wonderful about that discussion, though, is we went back and forth on how we could make it reversible. Like with Alfred and Susie, we have the materials. So we have the skins, or they have the skins. So if that they should decide to do that. The other thing too, though, we not getting around the laws, but we can actually loan it, the restored piece, to the museum as well.
Maybe before we open it up to the floor, I'll ask our speakers if they have any questions for one another after the presentations, or any comments.
I have a comment. It's been a really interesting progression in the Siberian project, thinking about providing access. When I first started thinking about the project and writing the grants, I was initially told, well, you know, they don't speak English, which was obvious. They don't have computers. So there's really, I mean, you can preserve these things and you can make them accessible to people who come to the States, but that's about the most you can do. Then, a couple of years later, I wrote the grant again and we had a panel of Siberian scholars who I spoke to all the way along in developing the project, and they said, oh yes, well now there are computers in schools and in libraries, and so it's no problem, you can really give access to the pieces. So we designed the project, you know, thinking we would write blogs as we could and distribute flash drives as we could, thinking, okay, this is great, we're really providing access, it's kind of the best we can do, it's a really long way, people can't come from Siberia very often. And then in talking to Sven this week, we learned that, well, yeah, they do have computers, and sometimes they can get to them in the right season, but it could take 5 minutes to download one image. And so that's got us rethinking access again. You know, I think times change and technology changes, but it's not necessarily where you want it to be when you're doing the best job you can do at the time. And so, again, we're rethinking how can we provide access in a different way. And we'll probably take some of the money we would use for flash drives and print up pictures, literally print them and give them to people to disseminate in Siberia, unless we think of a better idea. But it's, you know, these things are very open-ended. They don't just end when you conserve the pieces, if your goal is to provide access.
We'll open it up to the floor for questions for the speakers.
It seems odd to me that in an indigenous Alutiiq community, there would be a kayak that would be so specialized that it could confidently be called only a warrior's kayak or a whaling kayak. Why do you think that it was so specialized, and how would it have differed from another kind of kayak that might have been in the same village?
One of the things we didn't talk about with that kayak is there's human hair sewn into the bow part, and that's where Ronnie identified as it being special as a warrior's kayak. And then we went to look at the photographs labeled, and that one, in that label, it labeled it as a Alutiiq warrior's kayak. And so based on his knowledge and him sharing that's actually a very special kayak, because a lot of the kayaks don't have hair sewn into them as this one was. And the hair is probably, what, about 6 inches long? That's coming out of the bow. And what I learned from both Ronnie Lind and then over the past few years is hair sewn into an object is a way of remembering that person or embodying their spirit and power. And so based on that, we're assuming it probably was a warrior, a good whaler, who they took a piece of their hair and sewed, or hairs, and sewed it into the kayak for their ability to be better hunters. And that's...
But the kayak would have been like other ones?
Yes.
Wouldn't have been...
it would have,
would have looked the same and been
Yes.
constructed the same
it
way.
would be constructed the same way.
This just happens to have the embellishment of that ceremonial use.
Yes.
Thank you.
And actually, building on that, Sven, so with that embodiment of that individual in the kayak, how does that require special care as you move forward to conserve this, how you treat this, how you may even display it?
That's something that we did discuss, but it's entirely up to, it's up to the community on what they want to do. This kayak is so special, but the other thing too is there's used to be thousands of kayaks. but that is the only living one we have. So for us to restrict access to it would actually, I think, stifle any further growth. And I think it's important not to do that. Let's learn from that single man warrior's kayak and figure out how to reverse engineer that so that our own children can start making those, as we started with the Anyaks.
Good. In fact, I mean, and that really is an important point that I plan to touch on. And that is, when we're talking about fidelity, when we're talking about intention, the only people who can make that decision, who can make that kind of assessment, is the community itself. This is their business entirely, no one else's. So culture is a living thing, culture is flexible, and the Alutiiq are changing, but they are changing, in their own way, on their own pace, and making decisions every day in that regard.
I think this may be one of the ways too in which one of the things we think about a lot in this conservation initiative here is how do these kinds of contexts differ from, say, the standard restoration of a Michelangelo, where the discussion about the fidelity to the artist's intention. It's presumed it's a singular artist, however historically inaccurate that might be, and an artist with a reputation that is upheld by centuries of scholarship, and the assumption often, I think, with indigenous materials is that the sort of long-standing, with rare exceptions, lack of ability to attribute individual hands to the making of objects, and thus those same kinds of questions about the intentionality of the individual maker haven't been asked. But this raises a different kind of issue, which is where the intention of the maker is irretrievable for whatever reasons. Does that shift our criteria for thinking about what to do with the object in the present? And it speaks to your comments about sort of multiple intentions and investments in the status of the object in the present, which is interesting and I think raises some variables that may not be operating in the conservation of other kinds of objects in art museums.
And in terms of preservation and conservation, if anyone would like to address the point where the collector / dealer and their imprint on what they do to an object for the display in their own collection or for making it more desirable, and have any of you come across that, and how do you deal with that? Because as these objects are reaching art with a capital A and becoming increasingly more and more valuable, collectors have their own view on how those things should look. And sometimes I think we're losing evidence, we're losing context, we're losing a lot just so it can look pretty on their shelf.
There's certainly cases that I know of, say, African objects that were altered dramatically by collectors, taken off their bases so they look more, figural sculpture in a kind of Western framework, or polished to make them shiny. I mean, there certainly have been those kinds of interventions. I don't know if those kinds of interventions have been as obvious in the collections that you both
these
manage.
are really old collections, and
They're museums.
some of the pieces came through dealers, but most of them came. I would say most of them came through expedition. There certainly were plenty of donations, but they were more of the early expedition type in the vast majority. When I first came to the museum, I heard a rumor that Franz Boas used to repaint the pieces to make them look better. I have found no evidence of that, but we've certainly found plenty of pieces that were repainted but we know they were repainted in use. So that one kind of went nowhere. Sure, dealers do plenty of things.
But it's
they
really
take
the
corrosion off
collector
and shine
too.
them up.
I was
Collectors.
I was recently involved with a three-dimensional object that had come out of an archaeological context in Alaska, and it was wooden. And fortunately, the intervention happened as it came out of the archaeological context and got into the hands of a professionally trained conservator specializing in waterlogged wooden objects. And it was as you can imagine, probably like a 7-month process of bringing that object back to room temperature and extracting all of the moisture out of the wooden object. And in order for that not to crack, warp, or deteriorate, it then was impregnated with PEG and given a very thin coat of a protective wax. So that would have seemed like the proper thing to do, and probably the avenue that a conservator in a museum would have done had that come out of a dig being done by a museum or an archaeologist. So the market responded, the collectors responded to this based on an archaeologist / collector who was known to collect these things, and that word was put out that it was over-restored. And that by putting wax on it, totally ruined this object. And the wax was reversible, and as you know, the PEG is reversible. So here was a case where the collectors went crazy, that this was over-restored. And I tried to explain to them that it was not over-restored, it just looks like it did 2,000 years ago when it was buried and frozen. So it was an interesting exchange, but the final word by the collectors were, I don't like it. I would have rather have had it warped, cracked, and looking like some dusty old artifact. I thought I would share that just because it was such a unique situation, and it's amazing how much, well, first of all, how much collectors sometimes depend on the dealer for this information, because once it entered into the dealer realm, they just jumped on that bandwagon, and anybody who was interested in this object was scared away from it, saying that it was over-restored.
Correct me if I'm wrong, isn't part of the rationale behind reversibility of treatment the fact that aesthetic proclivities change over time, and what seems like it's the right or best looking thing to do in one generation or by one set of people is often overturned later, and that there were reasons that you want to be able to dial back some of those treatments as values change around.
Well, that could be done with this object. You know, the wax could be removed, the PEG could be removed, but then you're faced with the issue of what are you going to replace the PEG with?
Well, why don't you just reduce the PEG that's on the surface to make it look like it's not so shiny and waxy, but keep the PEG on the inside? Why wouldn't
The ultimate question is whose aesthetics are you
I mean, we're not seeing it.
needing to satisfy?
Well, exactly, and I haven't fully disclosed what it is and all of that, but it was a 2,000-year-old wooden object.
Yeah.
Just a remark, I mean, to start with, you start with an archaeological object that was in an archaeological context in a dig. So this is probably the most irreversible act you can do.
It was wrapped in polar bear hide. And it was wrapped in polar bear hide, which probably accounts for a great deal of its untouched state. But I was told the fact that it entered conservation before it was allowed to begin to deteriorate. So it basically went from that context into a freezer into the conservator's hand. And we had to send ice to Eskimo to get it.
I have a question about who provides funding for these projects. I know both of the conservators cited the Institute for Museum and Library Services. Are there a lot of people willing to fund these projects, or is it really difficult to come up with? I mean, I think everyone here agrees that they're very valuable and they contribute a lot, both to museum conservators, the academic institutions that are involved, and to the Native communities. So where can we find support for this work in the future?
Currently, the Institute of Museum and Library Services is really supporting these efforts, and they are, in the last 2-3 years, have really developed some new programs to help all kinds of efforts, not solely for the kinds of projects that we have been discussing here, but also for language revitalization and other aspects of Native culture.
Right, they have a separate category, right? For
Oh,
Native,
yes.
right, it's a separate grant application, yeah.
But is that the single opportunity that we have for funding sources? Or are there other, maybe people who work in other related fields know other places to look? That seems very limited from my perspective.
Well, for conservation, it is extraordinarily limited. For things like language reattainment and other similar needs, for instance, NEA, we know has some programs. There are very few there. But there's more, maybe more out on the West Coast?
There is, but there are challenges too. I was fortunate to have this massive grant from the Social Sciences Humanity Research Council of $2.5 million, but it took us 4 years to get it. And part of the challenge was that they really liked what we planned to do in an abstract way, that's try to identify how and why intellectual property issues arose and how could we work to address those. But they didn't like our methodology for our community studies, putting the communities in control. They just did not like that, because once you put the community in control, we as academics lose control. And yet we were able to finally convince them, in part because many of us had had long-term relations with the communities with whom we were working. But it's a very challenging kind of research, especially for young scholars who are trying to do collaborative research, because it puts them in risk. Because if you're doing collaborative projects and going for tenure promotion, and you have a project set up, and then you have a new chief and council come in who don't like the project, you may put 4 or 5 years into a dissertation, and now you're back to scratch. So there are some real challenges, but this work is so rewarding, and it's so important.
Hi. I'd like to add something that people might find interesting. I read something recently by Roger Allen. He's a pretty well-known sailor, New England sailor, and author of rowboats and about rowing and sailing. And he wrote, rowing as we practice it is more reflective of the real world, in that you are sitting facing backwards, rowing forwards, and peering into the future every once in a while, which is the Greek, if I'm right, the Greek concept of time, that you are flying through time facing backwards. And he goes on to say that in the spirit world, the Arctic peoples, the Polynesians, they row facing forward, they paddle facing forward, and they see into the future through the spirit world. Yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. And also, kayak culture in Greenland has seen a strong resurgence over the last 20, 30 years. And in reference to, I think, Professor Nichols,
Yes.
is that right? One of your points was to have a dictionary of kayak parts in English and in Alutiiq. And the Greenlanders do have that. They do have Greenland names and English names for all the various parts. Yeah, and there's a question there somewhere. No, one more thing was that, if I'm right, as far as I know, it's the men who builds the wooden frames, which is very, very Old Testament in that, like in Adam taking a rib out of his body and making woman. It's the men who builds the frames, but it's the women who do the sewing. So the women sews the skins onto the wooden frames, traditionally, as they do sew the mucklucks, and they use super intricate sewing that doesn't pierce the thickness of the skins, thereby allowing water to come in through the needle holes. So the needle travels through the thickness of the skin without coming through on the exterior surface. So that is really amazing. And my question is the human hair on that kayak from a man or from a woman? Is there any knowledge about that?
We don't know the gender.
Okay.
Yeah, it could have been from a woman or it could have been from a man, because
Right.
women were, in our society, they were allowed to hunt. It just depended on their father and helping them be able to hunt. But to answer your question about the language in terms of Alutiiq words, I've been comparing Pinard's notes. He collected a bunch of Alutiiq words that we don't use anymore for trying to find the names of the actual parts of the kayak. And I have used Greenlandic words as a comparison to talk to the elders, and also Yupik words. So I've been using several different cultures to try to figure out which words we don't have and find out if there's a correlation. I'm doing that.
Good.
Yeah.
Quite a challenge.
Yes. Time for one or two more questions.
I'm just wondering, has there been any discussion in the community about having DNA done on the human hair? You could determine gender, for one thing, but I don't know, if I'm presuming there weren't field notes when the kayak was collected that actually identified it to the individual?
No, this was a purchase through a gentleman who was there under the U.S. Army, so to speak, shortly after, he was a surveyor, shortly after the land passed to U.S. from the Russians. So there's very little information on any of the items that also came in as part of the succession.
In terms of the human hair, we had a whole, I think it was about 2 hours of just everybody testing each other's hair. And my daughter, myself, Alfred, Susan, and all the staff. We all pulled our own hair, and then we looked at it through a microscope, and we were able to determine that it was a native person, just based on the types of hair follicles. But we didn't, and we haven't actually pursued the DNA just because of funding.
Last question.
Have you been able to test any of the paddles or the boats that you've been working on, as in terms of putting them in the water?
The paddles were tested by a carver in Kodiak, and the double-bladed paddles, and he was just ecstatic on how well it worked.
I actually was curious about that because they look so different than kayak paddles that I've used before in terms of that they're so narrow comparatively.
You get a lot more torque, a lot more power, but they're also built for stealth. They're not made with the rounded thing where the tips, and if you do it right, you don't splash a lot. So you can move pretty quietly through the water. If you've actually kayaked in a traditional kayak, it's kind of freaky. Because we're used to this stiff board. When you get into a kayak, it actually flexes with every movement that you make, but also the flexing with the water. So you feel like you're with the water, not just on top of it. And I'm looking forward to actually experimenting with the Onyak in terms of what we can learn in that boat.
Have you haven't put the hide on it yet?
No, we're doing that
The
next
frame.
year, yeah.
Okay.
A connected question would be, in terms of revitalizing these traditional ways of making these boats, has there any, I mean, I know that this is just starting to happen again, so I assume you want to use the traditional materials to see what the benefits are and everything, but are there discussions of alternatives in terms of the availability of these materials or the sustainability of using them and alternatives?
Well, we're using twine instead of sinew, and we'll use an airplane fabric to wrap the boat, just because it takes so much time and work to process the sea lion skins. And the idea of the stitching, that's something that we're also relearning by looking through museum collections like the gut skin jackets and waterproof stitching, looking at the kayak, which is something we've spent a lot of time looking at in terms of trying to understand how that stitching was done, so we can make sure that we don't forget it again.
One of the things that really struck me in the presentation was the decision to leave the repairs to the kayak visible, not primarily for conservation purposes. Or now, you know, for a long time in sort of art conservation, you tried to hide the conservation treatment so that you restored the object to sort of, you know, pristine visual sense. And now the thinking is you make the repairs visible so people can tell the difference between the repaired spots, the conserved spots, and the rest of the object. But here, the logic of doing that was not driven by exhibition needs or primarily by aesthetics, as you said, but by the information that the placement of the repairs gives boat makers today about where the stress points are. And again, it speaks to this idea that familiar procedures are being undertaken, but with a different logic in mind, with a different sense of communication and audience and needs. But here in this context, one that isn't incompatible, it's just different and compatible, and that was very interesting. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for your presentations, and we invite you to stay and continue the conversation over a glass of wine.